I'm Amrit Deer, and it's my pleasure to introduce Emily Baxter, who is the director of We Are All Criminals and a current fellow at the University of Minnesota Law School's Robina Institute of Criminal Law and Criminal Justice. I'm going to speak for just a few minutes, but Emily asked me not to speak too specifically about what WAC does. WAC is, I think, the best acronym, because she'll be speaking about that for most of the next 40 minutes or so. So I want to take just 90 seconds and tell you a little bit about why this movement motivates me and why I'm really glad that Emily has come and accepted our offer to come speak at Google. So there are at least two broad reasons that I can point to. The first is that I am, like probably many of us, a serial criminal offender. Yeah, that was a woohoo for everyone who couldn't hear. Just yesterday, for example, while taking Emily on a brief walking tour of San Francisco, I jaywalked. The fact that we can commit crimes and have zero implications for it, or close to zero consequences for it, is more than just being crafty at committing these crimes. It's about, for example, the neighborhood you live in or the social stratum that you've happen to have been born in, and that is unfair. The second reason is related. Before joining Google, I went to law school, and although I knew about 2 weeks into civil procedure that I shouldn't be a lawyer, there was one class. I know there's some lawyers in the room, which I'm glad to see. There was one class that really motivated me, and I know motivated a lot of other classmates, and motivated, I should say, actually infuriated me, and that was criminal law. You learn a lot in that class, and one of the things that I took away was that our criminal justice system has become a lot about retribution, in some ways more than rehabilitation, and in many ways I would argue more about punishment and incarceration than deterrence and protection. Yet, I've seen encouraging signs in the past couple years, and I would say in the past couple months as well, and I think that we may be in for a watershed moment on this issue. From national media to casual conversations to John Oliver's repeated brilliance, there appears to be increased attention, increased empathy in the public dialogue on incarceration, criminal records, reintegration, and reform. And if that's right, and actually I should caveat that this may actually go against my prediction, but I also think that we're at a watershed moment for bidets in bathrooms, which is a very Google point. So I could be wrong about either one or both. But if that's right, I think Emily Baxter and We Are All Criminals will have been an important part of that movement and that awakening. So please join me in welcoming Emily Baxter.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Several years ago, I was working at a legal... Is that some feedback? Okay. Several years ago, I was working at a legal advocacy organization's expungement clinic. Monthly workshops held in the basement of a government center in small windowless rooms. I'm sure the sun had long since set by the time our final participant walked in. Anthony came in and sat across the table from me and pulled from his back pocket a copy of his criminal record, a printout he had received from a terminal upstairs. I opened it up and was thankful to find that it was just a theft, and a minor one at that. I let out a short laugh of relief. Even if the court didn't expunge the matter, I said, it's not like your life is over. And with that, Anthony began to cry. He told me that earlier that day he had considered taking his own life. You see, for me, it was just a theft. But for Anthony, it was a lost job. It was missed housing payments. It was skipped meals. It was door after door slammed in his face. It was the loss of respect from his friends and family, the loss of a sense of self, and the loss of hope. Around this same time, I had been driving all around the state of Minnesota, meeting with employers and landlords, legislators and licensing boards, asking them to create the capacity for second chances for individuals with criminal records. Time and again, I heard, you can't trust a con. Once a criminal, always a criminal. As I looked at Anthony, these words came back to me. And I thought, how many times had I taken something that wasn't mine? Sure, I considered my own criminality before, but not like this. I hadn't honestly thought about what life would be like in the shadow of that criminal record, under the stifling stigma of having been caught. What would life be like for me if I didn't have the luxury to forget? For the past 3 years, I've been traveling all across the US, asking people like me, the 75% of us that haven't been caught, those of us with criminal histories but no record, that very question. What if you had the luxury to forget? Today I want to share with you some of those stories. Some will be petty, some quite serious. Some happened recently, others decades ago. I hope that through this I provide for you another way of looking at the true and disparate impact of our criminal and juvenile justice systems on poor communities, communities of color, and American Indians throughout the US. But first, let's make sure we're all on the same page. This is a graph taken from data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and it shows, as you can see, the US state and federal prison population between 1925 and 2013. Now, barring for some general population growth, you can see that the number of people we put behind bars in the US remained fairly steady until about the 1970s. More than 4 decades ago, we began this, the deliberate and regrettable march toward caging more than 1.5 million people across the United States. 4 decades of wars on drugs and poverty and mental illness, 3 strikes policies, mandatory minimums, private prisons, and concentrated policing in minority communities are just some of the policies and practices that have led us to this mass disaster. What's doubly concerning, I think, is that even once people are no longer locked up, they find themselves locked out. Locked out of jobs, employment opportunities, housing, and countless other ways to move on and move up in life. Now, before I get into those collateral consequences or the everlasting impact of a criminal record upon one's life, let's turn back to the graph. As I said, this shows the US state and federal prison population. But just as importantly is what it doesn't show. For example, it doesn't show the millions of people across the United States who are in county jails. It doesn't show those who are in immigration holds, mental health holds, or the kids in juvenile detention. They are not shown here on this graph. It doesn't show the millions of people who are on probation or parole, their liberties curtailed under the thumb of the criminal justice system, yet not spending nights behind bars. They are not shown here on this graph. It doesn't show the estimated 65 to 100 million people in the United States who have a criminal record, who carry that legacy of the interaction with the criminal justice system. They are not shown here on this graph. And just as importantly, it doesn't show the nearly 3 million sons and daughters, the countless brothers and sisters, mothers and fathers, spouses and partners, and greater community members who can all be profoundly impacted when someone is taken out of the home and then not allowed back in. They are not shown here on this graph. And so what initially appears to be a tsunami of humanity ready to crash upon our shores is really just a drop in the greater ocean of a crisis. This comes at no small cost. The United States spends approximately $80 billion a year locking people up. And that doesn't even capture it all. There's a hidden cost. That which communities spend to house, train, counsel, educate, treat, and employ, and otherwise transition individuals who are leaving prison or jail. And that is a burden that falls disproportionately upon poor communities and communities of color. For example, across the US, there are more than 12 million arrests each year. 80% of those individuals who are arrested are eligible for public defense. In some jurisdictions, that means that you make less than $3,000 a year. Can you fathom that? Not can you fathom that poverty exists. I think we're all bright enough for that. Can you personally fathom living on $3,000 a year? That is a staggering level of poverty. Likewise, communities of color are disproportionately impacted. For example, the lifetime likelihood of imprisonment for Black men is 1 in 3. 1 in 3. That shouldn't sit well with any of us. Meanwhile, white women such as myself benefit from a far greater cushion of 1 in 111. Now, that is not to say that white women have not committed crimes, but that's not who you see, proportionately speaking, within our criminal justice system. Likewise, the disparities start early. For kids, for example, some of the highest crime rates come from affluent teens, and yet, again, that's not who you see in our juvenile justice system. And as a note, for the children, for the youth, for the young adults who do cycle through our juvenile justice system, understand that record is no longer just tangible. It's no longer something that you can put through a shredder or actually destroy upon completion of that interaction. This scarlet letter is now stamped upon the ether, and it is something that no amount of scrubbing can come clean. Out of the juvenile world and back into the adult. According to the National Employment Law Project, great people located right here in your own backyard, say that 1 in 4 individuals in the US has a criminal record. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, that number may be closer to 1 in 3. And those waters just keep rising. Well, how do records affect people? Let's break it down. These are just a few. For example, employment. According to the Society for Human Resources Management, somewhere between 87 and 92% of employers conduct criminal history checks on individuals who are seeking to work at that place of employment. Many of those result in disqualifications if there is any mar on one's record, regardless of the recency of offense or the severity of the offense or the relevance of the offense to the job at hand. Safe and affordable housing can be impacted by the presence of a criminal record. That's for both public and private, which, despite federal efforts on the public end to make it more accessible, there has been great resistance among local housing authorities to follow through. Licensure, everything from practicing law to emptying a bedpan, can be impacted by the presence of a criminal record. The ability to receive government assistance or benefits. So if there's no other way, lawful way, of putting food in your belly or a roof over your head, we've cut that off as well. Education. Let's break this one down. The Common Application Form, the form that's used by more than 500 colleges and universities nationwide to determine the makeup of next year's new admissions, it asks the question, have you ever been convicted or adjudicated delinquent of an offense? Yes or no? Can you imagine your ability to access education limited to a checked box? Yes or no? And while some schools may say that is just one variable in a much larger algorithm, make no mistake the chilling effect that question has on individuals with records. Because unlike employment, here It's $20, $30, $50, $60. You have to pay to be denied. You have to pay just to be told that you're not a good fit. This at a time when there's no social science research that shows any bearing of past criminal activity on future campus safety, and at a time when countless research shows us that access to education can be one of the greatest determining factors in a reduced recidivism rate. We should be pushing kids into school at a time when we're locking them out. Immigration, the ability both to stay in the U.S. and to petition family to join, can be impacted by the presence of a criminal record. The ability to travel. When I was working at the Council on Crime and Justice, a nonprofit in Minnesota, we had a woman come into the office. Several years before, she had been a member of the Red Hat Society. For those of you who don't know, the Red Hat Society is something of a social group, a membership organization across the U.S. comprised primarily of women over the age of 55. It's a social group. They do lunches and brunches together. They have book clubs and debates. They volunteer together. They go to the theater together. And every now and then they charter a bus and go to Canada together. That's what this particular chapter had done. They got up to the border, and patrol came on and said, "I need to run everyone's background." The women all dutifully handed over their IDs, thinking nothing of it. Sometime later, patrol came back on. Walking down the aisle, he said, "You shall pass, you shall pass, you shall pass, you shall not." You see, 3 decades ago, this woman had been accused of an offense. She was never charged, much less convicted, but that arrest was enough to bar her entry into the country. Her sisterhood said, "See you later." And they dropped her off at a gas station. Did I mention that she's in a mobility chair? So here's this woman wearing her red hat and purple jacket, as they all do in the society, and in her mobility chair, at a payphone, calling back home to have money wired up so she can return. And she said that wasn't the worst part. I think that sounds pretty miserable. She said the worst part was as the bus was leaving, one of her sisters put down a window and said, "I thought I knew who you were." As if what had allegedly occurred more than 30 years ago was the full sum of this woman's character. Not those lunches, not those brunches, not those book clubs, not those debates, not the countless times that they had volunteered together or gone to theater together, not even the 4.5 hours it took to take that bus up to the border. None of that mattered. Suddenly she was reduced to a single moment in time. And as preposterous as that sounds, and I think it sounds pretty ridiculous, consider how often we do that. How often we think we know who someone is. How often a single moment in time, a criminal record or something found through a Google search, can eclipse every other aspect of that person. Voting, the ability to partake in the civic process, is also impacted in many states across the nation by the presence of a criminal record. So it's nearly every aspect of who we are and how we are, from personal to professional, from psychological to social. How we exist in the world is confined and defined by our criminal histories, but not for everyone. In fact, just for a few of us. Just for 1 in 4 of us, right? What about the other 75%? Those of us who have committed crimes but not been caught. I wanted to know if anybody would join me in this little experiment of considering what life would be like had we been burdened with a constant reminder of what we had once done. So I drew up a flyer that said, "We are all criminals. What if you had the luxury to forget?" and I left my contact information. I sent it out through our social service network when I was working at the nonprofit, but I asked our network not to respond. I didn't want to hear from people that I already knew. Instead, I asked them to forward it on to their friends, to their coffee clubs and church groups and neighborhood orgs. To my unending surprise, the phone actually started to ring. So I bought a camera and a recorder. I hopped in my hatchback, and I drove all across the state and now all across the United States, interviewing people in bars and in cars, in diners and on boats, anywhere where somebody might feel comfortable enough to disclose to me something that they've otherwise had the luxury to forget. I then took pictures of the participants, or mugshots, if you will, in a way that I hope relays an individuality and a personality and perhaps even a little humanity, without, of course, identity. And you can find the first 80 of those, of the more than 250 of those interviews, on the website at weareallcriminals.org. If you go on the site, and I would encourage you to do so, you'll note that if you tap a photo once, you'll see how the person is introduced in the world as a lawyer or a doctor, as a legislator or a peace officer. But then you will see after that how they would be introduced had they been caught. Assault, sale of controlled substances, theft. If you click twice, you'll go into the story. And here you will find a wide range in the severity of offenses, from quite serious, like aggravated robbery, to relatively innocuous, open bottle that was carrying from one house party to the next, petty theft that was failure to return a library book. That is an offense, by the way. The next one down was public urination. This gentleman now has a contract to work with the Department of Defense, some of the highest security clearance in the nation. Had he been caught, he would find difficulty getting a job at a gas station. I know because many of my clients with very similar records faced that refusal. You'll also find a wide range in the responses to the recollection of past transgressions. For example, this gentleman, when recalling a time that he had taken his uncle's hunting rifle out to college with him, he said that one drunken shot went right through the locking mechanism of a double-posted parking meter, letting loose $40 worth of quarters. He calls it his $40 shot, by the way. And he laughed throughout the entire interview. Other people wept throughout theirs, like this woman who recalled a time that she would pad her tips with bills from the till. She was working as a barista and felt that she was underappreciated. As she told me this, tears of shame streamed down her face. She said, "I can't imagine where I would be now had I been caught then." Many people recognize that crime was an event in their life course, not a static characteristic of who they are. And some stories were truly heartbreaking, or at least for me they are. You can read the full story, for example, of the gentleman for whom I took this photograph online. But I can give you the abridged version now. When he was just 15, his family moved to a rougher neighborhood than they had been in before, and the neighborhood before was already rough enough. He said the first few weeks he was mugged and beaten several times. But after a while, he noticed that when he hung around a certain group of guys, the beating stopped. So he did what perhaps many a logical person would do, and he joined the gang. Now, that didn't come for free, and the price was exacted one regrettable Saturday day, when he was told that if he didn't pick up a lead pipe and hit a child that looked a lot like him, a member of a rival gang, that he himself would be the one beaten. He made the decision, he said, that he has regretted every day since. In fact, now, even decades later, he says he wakes up at least once a month in the middle of the night screaming, thinking that it's all happening again. He picked up that pipe and he hit that child. Had he been caught, he would have been charged with first-degree assault for the benefit of a gang. He would have been certified to stand trial as an adult, where he would have been convicted. Once convicted, he would have entered the system, eventually finding himself in prison, then out of prison, in prison, out of prison, in prison, out of prison. That cycle that happens to millions of people across the U.S. He wasn't caught. He graduated from high school. He got a scholarship to go to college, where he said that for the first time in his life, he was able to read an entire paragraph. He could complete a math problem because for the first time, he wasn't constantly checking over his shoulder to see what was coming next. He could concentrate. He was safe. His grades skyrocketed. He graduated undergrad, went on to graduate school, and now has a PhD in biophysics. Am I saying that that would be impossible had he been caught? No. But let's break it down. He wouldn't have graduated on time. He likely wouldn't have gotten that scholarship. Applying at that school, he would have had to check that box saying that he had been convicted of an offense, and chances are he would be told that he's not a very good character fit. Even if he had passed all of those barriers, once in school, trying to find jobs or internships, after school, finding more employment and promotions, and any of the other opportunities that he's had in life, all likely would have been met with that question, have you ever been convicted of an offense? Yes or no? And he would have answered, yes. Now, by no means am I suggesting that we should somehow forget the harm that occurs across the U.S., that we should somehow pretend that people aren't victimized. They absolutely are. What I'm asking is that when we construct responses to that harm, when we construct those consequences, that they be reasonable, that they be rational, that they be proportionate, that they be merciful, and above all else, that there be an end to that punishment. Because without hope, what does one have? Time and again, I heard from people that said that they engaged in criminal activity so that they could feel like they were part of a social circle, like this gentleman who donated some of his FAFSA funds to help finance a drug ring. Or this woman who sold weed to frat bros and football players so that she could get a "hey, what's up" in the hallway. She said she was sick of feeling invisible. And then there are some that just can't quite get their heads around where they would be now had they been caught then. Like the woman for whom I took this photograph. When she was 16 years old, she said she was a bit of a nerd, a chemistry buff. One bored July day, she and some of her nerd friends decided that they would make their own homemade napalm, which you can do with just a few common household ingredients, by the way. They put this in an apple cider glass jar, let it sit overnight, and then took it out to a state park, where they found the small, ideal, enclosed space upon which they could test their substance. They doused the inside of the porta potty with this highly flammable viscous gel. They lit a tennis ball on fire, lobbed it in, and watched it blow. They then ran back to their cars and drove the speed limit the entire way home, terrified over what had just happened. The day that I interviewed her, she had been keeping a 3-month-old heart alive with her index finger, beating it for the baby. She's a pediatrician. In her state and in many others, that would have been an impossibility had she been caught. She would have faced a lifetime barrier to working with vulnerable individuals, most definitely youth. It gives you pause, doesn't it? Or at least I think it should. When you consider all of the waste across the U.S., all of those foreclosed futures before brains are even fully developed. And then there are some stories that I heard that I honestly can't believe we're still talking about in 2015. And not every state, but this woman told me about a time a few years ago when her husband had been diagnosed with a form of cancer that was it was debilitating as well as terminal. She said that in the last few months of his life, his body was so crippled with pain that he couldn't pick up a pencil or shampoo his own hair. This man, who had been an active Marine just the year before, ostensibly at the peak of his physical career, now couldn't even bathe himself. She said the only thing that could assuage that pain was pot. Now, she had asthma, so he couldn't smoke it. So instead, she put the pot in the butter and the butter in the brownies, and together they would eat it. She said that when they did, for just a few moments, he could relax his hand enough to hold hers. He died. Her life stopped. She said that she doesn't remember what she did with the pot. Maybe she used it? She doesn't think so. Maybe her friends did. That's more likely, she said. Maybe she threw it away. It didn't matter. The point was, her husband had just died. She said, "Is that something you think you can use?" And I told her about a phone call I had received. There was a woman who, a few years before, had been living with her only son, a man in his mid-40s, when he was diagnosed with a particularly aggressive and terminal form of cancer. In the last few months of his life, the only thing that could assuage his pain was pot. Now, she didn't have asthma, so he straight up smoked it. And when he did, she said, it's like her baby was back with her again. He died. Her life stopped. She said she doesn't remember, or she said that she didn't throw his work boots from the back door or his toothbrush from the bathroom sink. And she didn't toss the baggies of pot that were in the freezer. A few months went by, and police executed a warrant on her home, a search warrant. There had been accusations that she was warehousing drugs. They tore apart her place and found the marijuana in the freezer. She was charged and convicted with a felony possession of controlled substances. She was living in public housing, which means one strike, no fault, and you're out. This woman is 72 years old. She has no prior criminal record, and she's living on the streets. We talked about the cost, and we talked about the hidden cost. This is the human cost. We Are All Criminals seeks to remind viewers and readers that while we have all done something that we're not proud of, each and every one of us, we're also all human. And some of us may be in need of a second chance. But make no mistake, this is also a commentary on the disparate impact of our nation's policies, policing, and prosecution. Many, not all, but many of the participants have benefited from belonging to a race and class that is not overrepresented in our criminal justice system. And some people have been pretty straight up about that. Others are still trying to figure out what it means to be a criminal, like the gentleman for whom I took this photograph. Remember I said I sent the flyer out, and the flyer was forwarded on. By the time it got to this man, it was maybe 5 times removed, which meant that he had no context for the conversation, much less the project. He said that when he got that flyer, he was pissed off. He couldn't believe that some punk in the city was calling him a criminal just because he was a member of the human race. He said that for 3 weeks, he would pick up his phone and dial all but my last digit, wanting to call me up and ream me out. When he finally did punch that last number, it was not to complain, but to participate. You see, he recalled that he used to run drugs across Lake Superior. How do you forget something like that? You forget something like that when you think of drug trafficking as something that happens between strangers in darkened alleyways, not something that happens between college friends. You see, his freshman year, he had left his hometown, went across the lake, and went to a small private school. His sophomore year, he transferred back to his hometown and moved in with some of his old high school friends, who it turns out were no longer just smoking dope, now they were selling it. And he was the ideal conduit to the untapped market across those stormy waters, because he knew who the legitimate smokers were. He knew who the potential narcs were. So he said, they trained me in on phones. I would take the drugs, I would often take the money, but really, do you think that I did anything that would rise to the level of something criminal? He asked me, right? Yeah, I do, in fact. State, federal, not just criminal, felonious. And at that, he began to fall apart. He said, okay, wait a minute. So had I been caught, I wouldn't have graduated college. If I wouldn't have graduated college, I wouldn't have gotten that first internship where I met my wife. If I wouldn't have met my wife, I wouldn't now have my 2 sons. Okay. Let's say that by some cosmic confluence, I did still meet my wife. I still did have my 2 sons. What kind of father would I be? He asked me. For example, every year he fills out an application to volunteer with his son's hockey league teams. And every year it asks the question, have you ever been convicted of, and then lists 10 offenses. And every year he blithely checks, no. He said, if instead they were to ask, have you ever committed any of the following? He doesn't know how he would answer. And had he been caught, he doesn't know what he would do. He said, I would have 3 options. Number 1, I could just lie. I could say no. This is a man who nearly got an ulcer from a flyer. Dude is not about to lie. If somebody were to Google him and find out that he had a criminal record, he wouldn't be able to deal with it. So that was off the table. Number 2, he said, I could say, yes, we'll explain. This man is a business owner, and for the past 10 years, any time that question was answered in the affirmative, he would trash the app. He said he didn't want to work with a criminal. He said then and even if he did explain, he said he knows how parents are. He understands that the stigma wouldn't just stick with him, but would run down to his sons as well. And he wouldn't do anything to harm them. So that was off the table. He would only have one option left, option number 3. He could just not respond. He could just take himself out. I can't tell you how many people I've worked with that have just stopped responding. Because you can only get that door slammed in your face so many times before you say enough. Now, by no means am I saying that individuals with criminal records can't be amazing fathers. They absolutely can. Mothers, sisters, mentors, and leaders. What I am saying is that for the 75% of us who do not have a criminal record, we're constructing barriers to keep out the 25% who do, and oftentimes we don't even realize we're doing it. So here's what I hope. I hope that you see a bit of yourself in the photos and in the stories. I hope that in that reflection, you take note of the context that you've allowed yourself. I was young. I was drunk. I was stupid. I was in a bad relationship. I gave it back anyway. No one got hurt. It wasn't my idea. Whatever that context is, recognize that it may have existed for someone who was caught as well. Now, it may not be an excuse, but it is an opportunity to recognize a common humanity. I hope that you recognize the privilege that you may have experienced and appreciate that not everyone has benefited from that same privilege. I hope that you reflect upon how very patently different your own life could have been had you been caught, and consider those foreclosed futures of all of those who have been. Finally, I hope that it inspires you to take action. There are many ways, countless ways that you can get involved. Here at Google, you can adopt fair hiring practices and demand as much from your contractors and vendors. The contractors and vendors oftentimes say that they must bend to the will of their clients and cannot adopt fair hiring practices. However, if the client demands it, that's a different story. But more than that, more than just passively accepting people with criminal records, you have the opportunity to be leaders in this field. Leaders in the field of second chances by actively partnering with organizations that work with individuals who are coming out of the system. Externally, Google has become the place that many of us turn to first when we want to know more about somebody. I would encourage you to consider what that means for individuals who have criminal records. And I would ask that you think creatively about a way in which you can help create the space or the ability for people to reclaim their narratives online, so that the only information or the first information that comes up about somebody isn't something that is perhaps outdated, holds no relevance, and oftentimes is incorrect. But more than that, there are firms that people with means can pay tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars to help them recreate their narrative online, to help them reclaim their stories. But for the vast majority of people who are impacted by our criminal and juvenile justice systems, that's not a possibility. I would ask that you think about what Google can do to help solve that. Because this isn't going to happen on its own. Now, here's the good news. We're not alone in this. Across the US, there's a sea change in criminal justice. Political leaders from across the spectrum, faith leaders, business leaders, even Sesame Street is getting involved, is weighing in, is standing up and saying, enough. But without a radical reimagining of our criminal and juvenile justice systems, that can just be a Band-Aid on cancer. I'd argue that the first step in that reimagining is challenging the narrative of clean versus criminal, of good versus bad, of us versus them. And so I'd ask that you start now to think about what your own story would be. To think about what you've had the luxury to forget. To consider what your chalkboard would say. What if a Google search on you didn't pull up your carefully curated Facebook pics, or your LinkedIn profile page, or your marathon results, or your charity drive? What if instead it pulled up your mugshot? How different would life be for you? I I think that once you can truly appreciate that we are all criminals, I think then you can appreciate that we're all human. And some of us, perhaps 1 in 4 of us, may be in need of a second chance. We Are All Criminals is a call for reason and equity and mercy, and acknowledged ownership in the problem as well as the solution. So that soon, when Anthony opens that sheet of paper, the page that's used to define his character, he finds not thief, but father, caregiver, nurse, speaker of 6 languages, survivor of genocide, volunteer coach and avid reader, a man not defined by his worst moment, but by his true worth, with the luxury to forget and the opportunity to be forgiven. A man not tethered to his past, but fully able to live in the present and to dream of a future. Thank you.